Okay.
Well, hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Adult Child of Dysfunction. Today we have with us Julie. Julie is an American writer, a domestic adoptee, and an identical twin. She actually has two books, which I will let her explain, but really she explores what it's like to be an adoptee and what goes along with that and with your identity and belonging and everything else. So welcome, Julie. So happy to have you.
Thanks, Tammy. I'm thrilled to be on your show because I love listening to your podcast and have really enjoyed your previous guests.
Well, thank you very much. So tell us a little bit more. I mean, we deal with a lot of people who are adopted, no big deal, but very few people talk all the way through their stories because I love that you put in the notes that you kind of got more than you bargained for when you finally found your birth parents. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, my twin sister and I were adopted together, which is truly the biggest blessing that came out of closed adoption. I never had to worry about who I looked like because I was staring at her all the time. So to be adopted with a full sibling is a tremendous thing. Because we were together, I think some of the wounds that are associated with adoption were a little less sharp. I have a brother that's 2 years younger than me that was also adopted, not biologically related to him. And then my parents had 3 biological children after us. So we were this big blended family. And they did a really nice job of treating us all the same, same set of chores, same punishments if we dipped out of line. But one of the things, we didn't really talk about the adoption conversation very often. They would profess support for my sister and I if we ever wanted to look into our story, but we knew they didn't know anything, closed adoption, no information was passed on. And so while that whole adoption thing as trauma, the primal wound, which Nancy Verrier is the one that coined that term, that adoption is trauma that a baby holds within their body for the rest of their life. And it deals with abandonment, rejection, all of those issues were inside, probably percolating in our psyche. But because I had this twin and I knew who she looked like, some of that, was mitigated. And it wasn't until I was 30 and I had 3 kids that my husband and I had this conversation about, why don't you get at that? Let's see what's in your family history. I sent a letter off to Catholic Charities, who was my adoption agency, and they sent back a curt little letter. Nothing can be shared at this time. And at that time, the state adoption laws were what they were, and they changed in 2011, which coincided with me having a breast biopsy and really needing my medical history. What's going on? Is there other things I should be worried about? And that is the story of my first book. Twice a Daughter, my sister and I went down this path of let's figure out where we come from and why we were placed for adoption. We had no idea what we were walking into. Thank goodness I had her by my side to help with it. And thank goodness I was an adult, because
Right.
what I ran into identity wise and belonging wise was something that would have been very traumatic for a teenager or a young adult to deal with. My birth mom did not want any part of us in the first outreach to her. So that was the secondary rejection from the first mother. And not only that, on top of the health issue, my adoptive mom pulled back her support on the search too.
Oh,
So
wow.
I had all of these issues going on at the same time, but I've got my buddy, my sister with me, walking down that road, and certainly my husband too. So the Twice a Daughter is the story about the 5 years that it took us to literally find out who our birth parents were, where they came from. We learned all sorts of family secrets. And just to kind of cut to the end, I do find a brother and a sister. They didn't know about me. I didn't know about them. And I do have a long standing relationship with my birth mom now, but there's issues with her. The shame of being a birth mom and relinquishing two daughters really did form her character. And I write a lot about that in my second book, Belonging Matters, which are essays dealing with adoption and family and, the lines that are blurred between family and kinship.
So when you talk about, because a lot of people listening, if you don't know the history or the science behind adoption and what it does and the abandonment as a child, how old were you when you were adopted?
3 weeks old.
3 weeks old. Okay. So you quickly got into, and so you were adopted right at birth, basically. Like the process was in.
Basically, yeah. I mean, but the one thing that nobody ever used, that label that you have to put on that, I never thought of myself or considered myself an orphan until I started writing about my story. That wasn't
Interesting.
something I could put on myself. I just didn't do it. And now I definitely do say, I was an orphan for 3 weeks. And what does that mean? That means you have no history for 3 weeks. You don't belong to anybody. I belong to my sister. I belong to the orphanage. I was passing through with Catholic Charities and I didn't belong to my family yet. And that I think is an issue that adoptees all face is, where was I for 3 weeks? What happened? Who cared for us? Were my sister and I in the same room together? I mean, you can go on and on and on when you start actually thinking about it. But for years, I didn't think about it.
Do you know where you were those 3 weeks?
I have unearthed all those secrets.
Because
Gotten
I'm
to know
curious now.
I got to know a social worker through Catholic Charities. I'm part of a post-adoption support group through that adoption agency, and I got all of the non-identifying information from their files. I've been to that space, to my orphanage, which is not an orphanage anymore. It's a Catholic Relief Services organization. But I've been to the chapel where we were baptized. They still have nurses that served the orphanage when it was still functioning. They come back to our reunions. So I have this whole different sense of belonging to the place I only lived in for 3 weeks. And the other adoptees, that we call it our reunion when we go home for our to the space, we feel a sense of belonging to one another, because we have that shared history of this space and this whole idea of passing through an interim stage in life where you were just who you were, who was caring for you.
Absolutely. And interesting that you were only there 3 weeks. So I can only imagine the people that didn't get adopted until they were 5 or 6 or 7,
Yeah.
how abandoned and confused and lost and all
But
that other.
also so loved by these nuns that were running the orphanage. And I think, we have these terrible images in our mind. Lisa Wingate's books that she wrote Before We Were Yours, and then the follow-up After We Were Yours, about the true stories that came out about that Tennessee children's orphanage. We have terrible images in our mind, and this is a beautiful place. It still is a beautiful place. The fact that these caregivers come back and want to connect with adoptees, it leaves me with a warm feeling. And I think it's nice for me to connect to that piece at this point in my life.
Well, absolutely. And just the fact that, like you said, you were cared for, because there's so many people, it's obviously your birth parents were probably not in a great place if they gave you up for adoption. And especially if they didn't want to have anything to do with you 30 years later, at least be curious, but it sounds like they gave all 4 children or 5 children, you said, if it was your twins, and then you have other siblings that you found out about.
No, so my twin sister and I are my birth mother's only children.
Okay.
So she relinquished both of us. She never had any other children. And my birth father did get married, and so the siblings that I found, we share the same father.
Okay. Okay. So, and so talk about when they say adoption trauma. What does that mean to you? Like for the people listening, because again, I know people that are adopted. I don't know any of the back end story of it about all of that stuff. They all seem to be just normally well-adjusted
We
children.
we do a
Um,
really good job of putting up that front because we don't know any other way. Adoption trauma to me means not having the legal capability of accessing my personal background.
okay.
So that's part of the trauma, and the knowledge that your parents, both of them, did not want to raise you as their child.
And that is so simply put that I love it. That's what I was looking for. Because I mean, that's really what it's about. You know, you just, and especially if you go on this search and nobody will tell you and doors are shut after shut after shut, it's just like rejection over and over again. Like somebody tell me who the HE double hockey sticks I am,
Right?
you know?
Right.
And the medical history, you don't even think about how important a medical history is. You don't. And when you all of a sudden need it and you're in crises to not be able to even get it at that point. So you said it was a good 5 years later when you got it?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, and it trickled. I mean, it wasn't, my birth mom originally would not give me my birth father's name, and then she gave me the wrong name. So accessing his side of the story was turned out to be more crucial than accessing her side of the story. There was cancer in her side of the family. I never did get breast cancer, but the scare was there.
Right.
And I did come to find out that my aunt, my biological aunt, so my father's sister, died of breast cancer before she was 40.
Okay.
Which meant once my doctors knew all that, I went for all the BRCA gene testing and all sorts of extra testing. Um, and that, I don't have that gene, but I certainly have empathy for anyone that does carry that in their family history. So,
Right. But just not know. I mean, like you said, you grow up 30 years and you're like, I don't know. I don't know if my parents were happy, if they were sad, if they were good people, if they were bad people, if they, I mean, you don't know. You tie so much of, I mean, your whole, especially as an infant, your whole identity is wrapped around your caretakers and your parents and the people that are supposed to love and nurture and care for you.
and so do
So,
you know what we do as a result, us adoptees? And this is an interesting thing because I have many conversations with adoptees, is when you don't have information, you fill in the blanks. And as a kid, fantasy up the wazoo who these people were. My sister and I we were certain they were teenagers because, usually that's the case if they're high school sweethearts that have a little love fling and their parents say, no, you can't get married. And so, well, that was not the case. I flabbergasted. We found out that our birth parents were 26 and 23. They were adults. They were co-workers. He was Protestant. She was Catholic. He wouldn't convert, fighting, and then, adoption.
and then
So
adoption. So,
yeah,
wow.
yeah, it wasn't financial. It wasn't a childish fling. It was basically religion was part of the problem, and
Okay.
they couldn't work it out. He didn't want to convert, and she couldn't get married in the Catholic Church without him converting. So another one of
Wow.
those issues that go back to 60 years ago.
Yeah, I was gonna say nowadays,
Who
I don't know,
cares?
but I mean, that's again, and that's a whole nother, so that was chosen, like the religion was chosen over children, literally over your own children, which flabbergasts me that anybody can choose anything over their own children.
Maybe he was looking for an excuse to.
Yeah.
But one of the interesting things that came out, and going back to the whole identity and belonging conversation, is that I found out things about my birth parents I was raised in this Irish Catholic family, which I am Irish. I do have that heritage, but I did not have any clue that I'm also Native American.
Hmm.
Don't present that way, but it's a very strong gene on both sides of the family. And it's something as an adult, I'm still trying to figure out how I think about that. Um, I feel a little deprived that I didn't know about that culture. And certainly this plays into international adoptees, how they must feel being adopted into mostly white families and being pulled out of their culture and not
Oh, yeah.
having, that lived experience with their culture. So I have empathy for them too now as a result, because here's an interesting thing about the Native American piece. Because my birth father's name is not on my original birth record, I cannot claim to be Chippewa. His name has to be on there. So
Okay.
another piece of being denied entry, not being able to say you belong because of the stupid paperwork.
Isn't that crazy? That is
It,
crazy.
yeah, it
And
is.
who's to say, like, I know I have a lot of Indian, Native American Indian in me on both sides of my family, actually. And you saw it in my grandmother. Like you literally saw it with the thick hair, the thick black bushy hair. And it was funny, but it was generations deep. But
Right.
it was probably, she said she was born in 1921, and she said it was actually her grandmother was the first person that actually lived with the culture of American Indians, which is
Wow.
funny. Like everybody else had met, like it moved down and it was quickly with just a normal white family. And so her grandmother didn't live on a reservation, or was just, I guess, in the that would have been like late 1800s, was more of the coal miner group kind of thing. So it was very interesting finding out. But she said that even her grandmother, she never knew her, but she never experienced any of that culture. But it's a very unique culture. Very.
Yeah. And now adoption law is changing that if you have any kind of Native American heritage, it has to go back to the tribe and they have to be able to pass off on the adoption in order for it to happen. So a lot of good things have come out of changes in adoption law and to protect people's identity and their culture that they come from.
So once you went on this journey to kind of figure out, okay, who am I? I want to get to the bottom of this. Did you know, like growing up as a kid? I mean, obviously, you, like you said, you and your sister had these fantasies about what our parents did, who they were, and everything. How did it make you feel as a kid, other than not knowing, like with other friends and things like that? What were relationships like?
No, we didn't know any other kids that were adopted. So there was no conversation, or a sense of belonging with other adoptees growing up. But I do remember a specific incident of a sleepover, and I think I was probably sixth, seventh grade, and somebody saying, when after you're playing Ouija board or something like that, oh, you guys are adopted, right? And them asking questions about your real parents. And that was my first recollection of being irritated and angry. I
Okay.
was being talked about behind my back. People didn't understand the language. Um, I think my very curt reply was probably, my real parents are the ones that are raising me, and I don't know anything about my first set of parents.
Right.
End story. It wasn't a conversation that I welcomed. It came out of the blue. It was an ignorant conversation. And they were coming from a gossipy, standpoint, and I didn't like it at all.
No. And so now you can teach, you can be out there talking and explaining to people that it's, just judgment in general, because who knows, who knows why you were adopted. And I think it's just kind of like me dealing with alcoholism and addiction and everything. There's this stigma. So when I think, before I knew anybody that was adopted, and I think, why would people be adopted? You automatically, like my parents were both alcoholics and drug addicts. Well, my mom was a drug addict, my dad was an alcoholic. But I would automatically, if I had been adopted, in that being my backstory, I would assume that that's why people gave their kids away, because they were drug addicts and alcoholics. I would have never thought, oh, well, maybe they got killed in a car crash, or it
Maybe
was a
they lost
religious
all their,
thing.
yeah, or they lost all their money and they don't have the funds to raise a family and feed them and care for them, which,
E-
certainly that happens too.
Exactly. So there's got to be that stigma. It's just people, like you said, people's ignorance. They just don't know. So they make up their stories.
Right. And there is this whole movement since open adoption started to be more prevalent in the 1980s of a more positive adoption language. So when I was growing up in the 1960s, 70s, we talked about ourselves as being given up for adoption,
Yes.
which, and I have a whole essay about this in Belonging Matters. I was corrected by a friend of mine who actually adopted her son, and she said, you should refer to it as being placed for adoption. And while I agree with that terminology, I think every adoptee would say to you, we gave up something. Yes, we were given up for adoption. We lost our identity. We lost access to our first family. We lost access to any kind of family, medical history. So there were things that were given up. And so sanitizing the language in some standpoint appeases the adoptive parents more than it appeases the adoptees.
Yes, and I can definitely see that, just trying to use the language, because I remember my friend, and this was, 35 years ago, they were twins, and the brother had adopted a little boy, their family had adopted a little boy, and they never say that their parents gave him up. They always just said, he was gifted to us. And that was their language.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
their parents gifted him to us.
Yeah.
And I
My
always thought that.
parents used to say that we were their gift. But I truly believe that they believed that. I mean, after a lot of years of infertility, to get two daughters right away, an instant family, was a tremendous gift.
Right. And, it's like you saying, yeah, I can see that the parents, like, don't say given up, because then your adoptive parents are like, no, that makes them feel bad. Well, you still need to deal with that. You still need to be able to deal with that. And that's like everything else. Well, don't make me say something different. Like, let me feel what I feel. And that's,
Oh, yeah, you're right. That's part of the thing that you're supposed to keep quiet about, is how adoption makes you feel. And we never really talked about how disorienting it is. My family was a very loving family. I had a great childhood, but there was always that curiosity about who these people were and where were they? Were they going to come back for us someday? I mean, that goes on to the fantasy piece we were talking about earlier.
so how old were you when you knew you were adopted? Were you first grade, second grade?
I would guess probably around 4.
Okay.
Because I do remember, uh, that little nighttime chat about we didn't come out of mommy's tummy, you came out of a different mommy's tummy, and so it wasn't ever a secret, which was a good thing.
That is a good thing, because I've heard stories of people finding out when they're 30. They
Oh,
go for their medical history, and then all of a sudden, oh yeah, by the way. And that's,
or they find out after their parents pass away, and they find their adoption papers in their safe deposit box. So
yep.
that that late in learning would be very traumatic.
So what do you do now? Like, you wrote these 2 books. Are you like an advocate for adoptees, or you run, tell us what you do.
So I write a lot of essays about adoption. I also write a lot of things about family because my family, it provides a lot of material. Um, and I've got a third book that's coming out in a year. It's the prequel, so to speak, for Twice a Daughter. So it's what family life was like for my sister and I, growing up in this crazy family. We had a sibling that passed away suddenly. She also was special needs. So the whole family building issue, is what I address in the next book, and I think it provides a lot of background history to Twice a Daughter. It actually, I wasn't going to write about on any of that. And a lot of the readers, because Twice a Daughter's been out for almost 3 years, people wanted more. Readers said, well, what happened to you and your sister before all this?
Yeah.
So it's been really fun to write. I talk extensively with my twin about what she remembers and my mom. So it's been kind of like a joint venture, so to speak, to write these stories. And so that's what I do is I just write essays and blogs and these 3 books now.
So are there support groups for like adoptees for younger children that are adopted to kind of deal with and rehash some of the stuff before they go into adulthood?
Well, I'm going to answer that 2 ways. So my adoption support group that I'm part of is through Catholic Charities, and it's a group made up of adoptees, birth parents, and adoptive parents. And Catholic Charities facilitates that with a social worker to help people establish contact with their first families or deal with the idea of maybe doing that. I also serve on an adoption agency, and most of those adoptions that agency is doing is our open adoptions. So they connect their adoptive parents with each other and the kids every year at like a family picnic kind of
Okay.
thing. And I think that's a beautiful thing. I really do. I think that would have been nice growing up as kids to see other kids that were like us. And also for families to connect together with this shared experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what I was wondering, like what kind of support groups are there? Because it doesn't matter, like you said, I mean, even with my podcast, it's dysfunction, it's different. It's a wound that is eating you up until you get answers. And
Yeah.
to have just this camaraderie and the support of being with a bunch of people that are all like, oh, we're all adopted. Cool.
Yeah.
If you could go back, I'm just trying to think of a way to, I'm assuming you're 100% happy that you met your birth parents. Like that was
I never did get to meet my birth father. So
okay.
that would be something that would have been interesting. He
Okay.
did not want to meet my sister and I, even though I have a very good relationship with I call them my new brother and sister. They couldn't convince him to change his mind, and I respect his decision. It would have impacted uh, his personal life. So I didn't get to meet him, and the relationship that I have with my birth mom it's complicated. It's complicated. She has her own set of issues. She's 91, and she lives in a senior center, which means she's still living in the bubble of her peers.
Yeah.
So when my sister and I visit her, she doesn't let us sign in the guest book. And I don't know what she writes in there.
Oh,
So,
wow.
yeah. So I don't know if she writes friends visiting from Chicago. I don't know what she writes.
Well, that's
Um,
interesting. That's like a whole nother topic of being the person that puts a child up for adoption, what they, how their lives play out. Because
yes. Oh, it's
I
the
can't,
secrets and the shame that she carries with her still are
yeah,
so deeply ingrained. She never introduces us to anybody we run into as my daughters.
right,
Uh, and think about, and it really is, I have a lot of empathy for her and for birth mothers, because for many years she couldn't even acknowledge that she was a mother on Mother's Day,
right.
and the pain of our birthday, what that all meant, and still is tough for her, because it means joy, right? She's got these 2 biological daughters, but it also means sadness around not being able to have parented us. So,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. A whole nother issue. I didn't even, you don't, again, you don't think about that. You're just, being the way I grew up, and this is so ignorant of me that I picture people are bad people to give up their kids. Like I don't think about the other stuff. And that's, I mean, obviously not at 55, I don't still think that, but growing up, that's what I thought. It would have
Well,
never dawned on me to be empathic or empathetic to someone who gave up their kid.
yeah.
To me, there would be no excuse at all. So
Right.
that's
And I do come out on that issue with birth mothers. I think there's just so much hurt and loss there that people don't realize. I want to offer a comment though to what you just said. When I was embarking on this whole search, because I had this breast biopsy, um, a friend of mine, I was sitting down telling her the story, and she was, I could see how uncomfortable she was. And she was judging me for, as she said, well, don't you feel guilty about you being disloyal to your adoptive parents? So she took a completely different stance of I was being disloyal, that I should have put my gratitude to them in front of my need to know this medical history. So one of the things that I like to, bring out in this conversation is, if you don't wear the shoes, just try to sit back for a second and put yourself in those shoes, or ask the right questions,
right.
and not be so judgmental. If you are not touched by adoption in any shape or form, just listen,
Yeah.
listen.
Because it's not your world. You have no idea. You have no idea all the emotions and the guilt and the shame that are on both sides. And even with your adoptive parents, there's got to, I'm sure they feel bad. They feel bad that they didn't tell you earlier. They feel bad that they didn't hide it or make it easier. There's guilt and shame in everything. So just, yeah, if you're not involved, it's like just stay away. Like that's you know, or be compassionate on both sides and look, because you never know. And I always say that unless you walk in somebody's shoes, you have no right to judge, because
Right.
you don't know. And yeah, it's you've given me a whole, like my mind is spinning of all these different questions I could ask, because I know very few adopted people, first of all. But I did grow up with a couple people that, a couple of girls that had been adopted and everything, but I don't know the dynamics of it. I can only imagine what they are coming from all the different angles. And
Mhm.
as you get more into it, I'm sure I would have a million more questions. But I mean, I love what you did. I love that book. I'm gonna have to get the book for sure, because I just think it's interesting, and I love to the older I get, the more I run into people that are like, oh yeah, I'm adopted. But when you were a kid, I mean, I was with a set of twins who had an adopted brother, and they were all in the same grade. It never dawned on me. I knew they weren't triplets. Why it didn't dawn on me till eighth grade.
Yeah,
I'm like,
I
oh
think
wow,
they
you're
made
all
a
in the
good,
same.
yeah, they made a
Yeah.
good TV show called This Is Us about that same scenario.
Right. Never even dawned on me. I'm like, but then after they said, yeah, he's adopted, I was like, really? And they're like, Tammy, we're all the same age, and we're not triplets. I was like, oh yeah, very valid point. So, and I was an A student. So,
Yeah.
yeah, things you just assume. You don't think through the whole process and everything. But this is very enlightening. I love this. And I love that, it opens a new light for people to look at it compassionately and not judge, because you don't know what you don't know.
Right. And it's been interesting to see birth mothers. I speak to a lot of book clubs and adoption forums, and birth mothers either come up to me personally after the conversation. They very rarely raise their hand in discussion because it's still packed full of so much pain for them.
Oh, I can't even imagine. Cannot even imagine. And to be in a room, and I mean, it's got to be enlightening, and like I said, sad and happy and joyous and sad, but just wondering, especially the ones that aren't in contact with their children.
Mhm. Yeah.
Be, you know, I've, yeah, absolutely. But I'm excited. tell us if people want to reach out, are you open to questions? Are you open to,
Oh,
or do you
yeah,
just like,
absolutely. Absolutely. I have a website, juliemcgueauthor.com. There's a lot of information about me and my books and essays and discussion questions and such. So I'm always happy to talk to anybody one-on-one or to a group.
okay. And then, so the best place to reach you is just your website.
Right.
And I'm going to put all of your links in the show notes so everybody can follow along with whatever they want to follow, whether it's your blog, your post, your whatever it is. So, and then if you could leave the audience, because we have a lot of listeners from a lot of different genres, with one piece of advice having to do with the whole adoption platform, what would it be?
I'm going to give you two scenarios. So the
Okay.
first one is there's a lot of research about our brain that we can't feel joy and fear at the same time. And so my go-to is always to try to figure out that joyful moment. And in thinking about that, one of the happiest moments in my life was the day that I got to talk to my birth mother on the phone for the very first time. Just hearing her voice, having imagined it for almost 50 years, and then being able to speak to her on the phone was truly one of the most beautiful memories that I'll ever have. But as far as adoptees go, or anybody in the adoption triad, um, don't go into an adoption search and reunion blind. It's very easy to connect through DNA, Ancestry, any of the genealogical sites. And the caution I say is that there are so many experts, social workers, other adoptees, panels. It's so nice to be able to have someone make that connection for you, but also counseling you on what to expect. These are the pitfalls. These are the things to think about before you talk to that person for the first time. Do your homework, read, get involved in so many adoption forums online and certainly Zoom conversations. Do your homework before you jump in so that you know what to expect and you know what you might feel if you get a secondary rejection or something happens that you weren't prepared for.
Very good advice, because a lot of people probably do. They probably hear you and go, "Oh, I want to talk to my, my birth mother," and just reach out there and jump out, and they're not mentally prepared for that, probably, because you don't know what you're going to get hit with until you get hit with it, for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming. I appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, Tammy. Thanks for highlighting this issue. I appreciate that.
Oh yeah, definitely one we have not had before, and it's very intriguing. I'm going to have to ask more questions to you for sure. But for everybody else out there listening, the best message I got from this, especially when you're dealing with a group of people that you know nothing about, is do not judge. Do not walk until, like we said, until you can walk in their shoes. Just be compassionate and understanding of whatever anybody is going through, because you would want them to do the same thing for you. So thanks a lot, and you all have a great day, and we will see you back next week.